started. So as we gather here tonight, more Occupy sites are under threat of eviction and people are being arrested at the Occupy New York site. 15 people were arrested at the Occupy Nova Scotia site in Halifax on Friday. And we've also, I'm sure, have all read about the brutal actions being taken against Occupy participants in Oakland, New York, London, Ontario, and elsewhere. So before introducing tonight's special teach-in on campus, this is a great turnout, I would like to thank Matthew Hayes. There he is. Organizing the daily teach-ins at the Occupy Fredericton site that have been going on for the past 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
Yeah, and they're going to continue?
Next week we have a full lineup.
Okay. With such great topics as the case against imprisonment and many others that are important matters that we should be discussing in our community. So to stay updated on that, I guess you can check out the Occupy Fredericton Facebook site, the Occupy Fredericton website. There's also the community calendar email list that you can sign up, and that's just info@frederictonpeace.org to sign up there. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Thom Workman. Professor Workman received a PhD from York University. He's the current chair and a professor of political science here at UNB. His research interests include political and social thought, critical political discourses, Marxism, and labor history. He is currently involved in research projects, I hope this is an updated bio, on the political and social thought of Alfred North Whitehead, ancient Greek thought on war and empire, and imperialism in Canada. Professor Workman teaches courses on literature and politics, alternative political communities, alienation, modern political theory, political leadership, and conflict studies. And I know a number of you are former students of Professor Workman, so I think that speaks to the content and the value of taking courses with him, and I strongly suggest that you do so. Professor Workman has published a number of books and articles, including one that will be of interest to many of you that was published in Alternatives in spring 2011 called The Left After Politics, and I'll just leave it on this table if you want to look at it after the talk. His books include, they're right here, I'll also leave them on the table, Banking on Deception, The Discourse of Fiscal Crisis, Social Torment, Atlantic Canada, and the New World Order, and If You're in My Way, I'm Walking, The Assault on Working People Since 1970. Also strongly suggest that you read those, and they're published by Fernwood, and they're available, they're out there so that you can get them and read them. So tonight, Thom will speak on the politics of Occupy, state hostility, liberal populism, and the neoliberal class conjuncture. The talk will explore 3 themes or questions. What has been the response of the neoliberal elite? What is the politics of the Occupy movement itself? And what accounts for the Occupy movement? So, without further ado.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Welcome to UNB. It's nice to see integration between the campus and the community. And I just want to speak to that very briefly, because when UNB, which is big on community cooperation, or when UNB as an institution pushes greater kind of cooperation with the New Brunswick community, they usually don't mean anything in the spirit of the Occupy movement. And they certainly don't mean cooperation with community groups, generally speaking, anti-poverty organizations, labor. That's not what they really mean is cooperation with groups or various groups that might be representing Irving or McCain or whatever. So I think that this is something that is not uncharted for a university, but certainly not in the spirit of the university when it says it wants to promote greater community cooperation and greater work with the community. So it is nice to be able to be involved in something that might, I'm not sure how to say it, piss the university off of it. We are in the middle of something that is different, and there's certainly, I don't want to sound like I'm breaking into song, but there is something happening. And I really do think that we are not sure quite what it is yet. I know all of you have been following this daily, and probably it's the first thing you're doing. You get up in the morning, you check to see what's actually happening, and you have to do it in the morning because the police know that it's better to evict people in the dark, so there's usually something happening overnight. They've learned that very quickly, that there's less people can film it and take videos of it and so on if they do it in the wee hours in the morning. So every morning for the last week or so, we've been learning about the increasing tendency to have the movements dissembled and torn down and burned, and we've seen tents burned, we've seen libraries burned, we've seen people beaten by the police, we've been seeing people pepper sprayed. An 84-year-old woman in Seattle was pepper sprayed, and she was a former candidate for mayor. And I saw her being interviewed just today on Democracy Now! She was extremely articulate, and she was speaking not to her own circumstances. And when you saw the pictures of her with the pepper spray dripping off her face, they were disturbing, angering even, and yet even under those circumstances, what she did was she spoke to the increasing American military involvement in Australia, and she warned the Australians. She said, "Watch out, because when we show up, it's never going to go well for you." So we're seeing episodes like this day by day, and it's hard to get a perspective on it. It's hard to really make sense of it, and I'm just going to throw a few things out this evening to try to help that process along, but I don't want to pretend that I somehow have my head wrapped around it either. I think this is one of the most interesting things that has happened in the last few decades, and I have very little doubt that it's going to continue. In fact, my sense was really what came to an end 2 days ago was merely something that we might look back on and call the first phase, and that there's going to be a lot more happening. I'm going to break it down into three sections. I want to talk first about the response of the elite, what I think has been the response of the elite to the Occupy movement, generally speaking. Then I'm going to look a little bit at the confluence of circumstances that gave rise to Occupy. And I'm going to look a little bit especially about the trends that have been affecting the working class, particularly in North America, but around the world, that have kind of yep. And then I'm going to, oh, yes?
Sorry to interrupt. I was just wondering if you have any preference on being recorded or not.
Oh, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Now that I've made that slam at UMB, it's fine. And then I'll talk a little bit about the politics of it, and we'll, I'm sure, then have an opportunity to open it up for discussion. So let's talk first about the response of the elite. One thing that has been said frequently about capitalism in the last 100 years, and it doesn't apply only to the last 100 years, but it certainly does apply to the last century, is that it has an amazing capacity, a remarkable capacity to absorb criticism. And there are two interesting strands to this capacity to absorb criticism. One was flagged by the 20th century philosopher and commentator Herbert Marcuse a little over 50 years ago, when he said that really what happens is you take criticism and it just absorbs into a kind of non-political universe of discourse, or a non-political way of framing questions. So you have dissent in your society, but that dissent just basically disappears and gets recast as something that ends up supporting the system. We might call this the kind of twisting of genuine or authentic criticism into something like gentrified criticism, or criticism that the system can cope with quite easily. This was Marcuse's argument. There's another kind of argument that has emerged in the last 25 years or so, and it's equally interesting and even more dispiriting in some ways. And writers like Jim McQuiggan's book, Jim McQuiggan in a book called Cool Capitalism kind of captures this. And he says, one of the amazing things about capitalism is you can actually, the critical moments, the critical attitudes, the real rejection of the system ends up being absorbed into absorbed and expressed as new accumulation opportunities for the system itself. So it's actually empowering the overall kind of stability, or strengthening the overall stability of the capitalist system. Now, I think it's important to bear those things in mind as Occupy kind of courses its way over the next few months, because these observations tend to mean that the intentions are usually not borne out either at the level of public policy or at the level of meaningful change. And this is the kind of idea that's been bandied around for quite a while, and it's worth bearing in mind. The response of the elite, I think, and I'll be a bit provocative here, I think it has been basically scarcely concealed contempt has been the response of the moneyed elite. One of the ways that we can kind of figure this out is we let them speak for themselves. And early on in the movement, in its first week to 10 days, they used a language that was simply aggressive and contemptuous. And it was so aggressive that at about the 14-day period, when they realized that might not be good for their political aspirations or good for the re-election campaigns, they started to tone the language down. Paul Krugman in the New York Times summarized this very well. About 2 weeks into the article, 2 weeks into the Occupy movement, in one of his editorials in the New York Times, he said, look, they've done a funny turn here. They started out by just being contemptuous and trying to paint these occupiers with a language that was dismissive. And then slowly, he said, they realized, now this is one of the elite in a sense, an academic elite, an intellectual elite, and not a very terribly radical person, observing the elite of his own country. And he said, they started then to speak in a little more guarded manner. He said, they are still contemptuous, they are still disgusting, but they've learned to temper at least what they're saying a little bit, because it doesn't make for good airplay. It doesn't make for good sound bites. And we saw some of those bad sound bites. We saw references to mobs. We saw references to bandits. We saw people saying, the elite saying to the occupiers, get to work. How can you afford all this time? You shouldn't you be out looking for a job? We saw a presidential hopeful say to the occupiers, I don't understand you at all. If you have a problem with millionaires, go and become one. A kind of let them eat cake moment. The only change, or the only thing that might even slightly alter this idea of contempt, or this attitude of contempt, is a mild concern that somehow it might affect accumulation. If there is a message, if the occupiers are delivering a message saying, we are poor, we're too broke to buy your goods and services, then capital and families of capital starts to hear them. They start to listen a bit. And but even this threat is not that significant, because there's one very profound difference between the period now, the current conjuncture, and the recession or depression of 7 or 8 decades ago. And that is that now people's consumption, our need to buy goods and services, is embedded in our lives. We can't cut back that much. 70 or 80 years ago, you could say you could pass on a hairbrush or a curling iron, or even for that matter on a radio. You could pass on it. Now, consumption is so embedded, it's so part of the fabric of people's lives, that you can't really make much of a dent by altering your consumption habits. Everybody must buy a lot of stuff every day in order to survive. So there isn't even there a sense that the guardedness is as imperative as it might have been at another time, when people could have simply said, we're done, we're poor, and I'm not buying something. I'm going to make my clothes, I'm going to grow some of my own food in a backyard garden, and I'm going to withdraw from consumption considerably. And now we can't do that. So when you actually do see a 2 or 3% contraction in the economy, that's an astonishing contraction, given the fact that consumptive habits are absolutely embedded in the general population. So the only real concern that we have seen, aside from a vulgar political concern that it might not be good to badmouth people who have to, in the end, elect you, is the concern that if there's some truth to the Occupy movement, if people are really becoming so poor that they cannot basically carry on with a certain minimal level of human comfort and decency, then that might affect overall consumption and really start to send the economy into a tailspin. One of the, I think, most interesting proofs of the sheer contempt that has been exhibited by the elite for the Occupy movement emerged just about 10 to 12 days ago. And this was in the Greek context. As you know, the Greece government had worked out worked out some kind of an agreement to really an economic stay of execution vis-a-vis the Germans and the French. And this would mean that to avoid systematic default, they would have to enact a fairly severe austerity program. And it sounds strange to say a severe austerity program, but a austerity program that had to follow certain guidelines. And you know that was fairly severe because the International Monetary Fund is sitting there taking notes on it, and they've been doing this to countries for several decades. And the political leader of Greece, Papandreou, for his own kind of crass political reasons, not because he was had suddenly morphed into a democrat of substance, said that I'm going to put this to a referendum. So rather than simply agree to the bailout agreement for the Greece economy, he said, I'm going to ask my fellow citizens if they accept this austerity package. And the world exploded. The elites across Europe and North America just absolutely exploded. And so here was a politician suggesting, in the midst of the Occupy movement, suggesting that perhaps we ask the people in a democratic way what they might want with respect to this austerity package. And you had Europe and the French and Germans in particular going ballistic and threatening and waving fingers and basically starting to say to the Italians, so they're called rather derisively the pigs. I don't know if you know this. Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Spain, and Greece. Not necessarily in that order. These are the countries, and I'm going to talk about them a little later, that are in a kind of debt crisis. And I'm going to talk about the background to that crisis in a bit. They started wagging their fingers at the other countries saying, well, we may cut them loose, but if we cut them loose, you better watch out. And I'll talk a little bit about the aggressive attitude. The Guardian Weekly, hardly a terribly radical paper, had this to say, and again, if you want to know what the elite is thinking, they're amazingly capable, and they own all the newspapers anyway, and they're usually saying it. And so the Guardian Weekly said, the idea that the Greek people might directly be able to decide their future terrified leaders across Europe and around the world. They wrote this just November 8th. Financial markets panicked, sending stocks plummeting and bond yields soaring. The French and the Italian bond yields, for example, hit all-time highs. However, by the end of the week, things were back under control. The leaders of France and Germany apparently laid down the law to Papandreou, and he backed off plans for the referendum. While the government is in the process of collapsing in Greece, the world can now rest assured that the Greek people will not have an opportunity to vote on their future. So why do we say scarcely concealed contempt? Because in the middle of the Occupy movement, which is emphasizing democracy as much as it's emphasizing anything else, the moment a political leader said, I want to exercise, I want to do something that's genuinely or authentically democratic, the world exploded. And stopped him from doing this. In the last few days, the camps have been cleaned up. And we've had the misfortune of listening to the Bloombergs of the world tell us why the camps are being cleaned up. They're cesspools. We've heard everything that they're dens of iniquity is the basic theme that's being played out here. They're full of dangerous illness. Sick people are there. Criminals are there. We've heard all sorts of language, disturbing language, hyperbole really, about who's living in these camps. Just today in the New York Times, for example, a woman was interviewed from the neighborhood in the financial district, and she said, I'm so glad they cleaned up the camps. As a resident here, I was becoming very concerned. I have to use the same doorknobs as they do. And so the pretext is that they're being cleaned. This was on the front page of the New York Times today. The pretext is that they had to clean up the camps. That the camps were becoming, to be colorful about it, dens of iniquity. Now this is very interesting. In the American context, in the last 3 years, we have seen countless tent cities emerge. They have become a very common feature of the North American landscape. They are so common, and this is usually a good indicator, not so much now because she's off the air, but they're so common, it's such a basic feature of the American urban landscape that Oprah did a special on it. In the summer of 2009, she did a special on tent cities, and she had one of her reporters, Lynn Lang, go into the tent cities and interview people in the tent cities and so on. And she ran one of her whole programs. She dedicated one of her whole programs to tent cities. The tent cities haven't gone away. They're still there. People are setting up tent cities in parking lots. People are tents in small wooded areas on the edges of town. Sometimes small wooded areas right inside cities. Beaches. There are several tent cities on the beaches in the United States, and most commonly and ironically in abandoned industrial zones there are tent cities. And they're in Canada, but they're especially prominent in the United States. And there is the usual. You would be able to probably predict who are using these tent cities. Most of them are families that have fairly recently been evicted from their homes. In the wave of evictions that has been running rampant since about late 2006, early 2007. Only on September 10th, the Business Insider ran one of many articles that have been ran on the tent cities in the United States, and it was written just before the Occupy movement started, and it featured a middle-aged fellow, Doug Hardman. He was a musician. He was part of the musicians union. He worked in Florida, and he lost his home in the housing crisis. And he kind of floats in and out of the tent city, and his biggest concern is that his children aren't too embarrassed by the fact that he's a resident in a tent city in New Jersey, and it's a tent city where you can actually see the kind of financial district of Manhattan. And this article was written on September 10th, just before the Occupy movement got going. It's only about half an hour south of Wall Street. So here is a tent city in the kind of shadows of southern Manhattan. The idea is, of course, very simple. Politicians don't give a care, really, about tent cities and the squalor and the so-called health problems and the crime that may be part of tent cities and so on. Of course, that's not really the case. Nor do they care really in the end about public health in that sense. They have broken up the tent cities that are part of Occupy because they don't like the political message. And it's fairly straightforward. The other tent cities haven't been torn down. And they're not going to tear them down. And as Michael Moore says all the time, they bloody well know. They're not ignorant about what they're doing. They understand full well that they are attacking these camps for political reasons, because they don't like the political message of the camps. The only problem that they encountered was how you were going to do it. The only issue was the timing. The issue was never about whether or not they were going to let them stand or anything like that. Every time a politician spoke in favor, and usually in a very guarded way, in favor of the Occupy movement, they were usually very careful to say, to distance their concepts from the actual camps themselves, and from the movements themselves. And you can bet your bottom dollar that the politicians were watching waiting for the signals very carefully, and looking for the pretext, looking for the opportunity, looking for any kind of excuse that they could use to go in and start busting up these camps. And so they started to do it. And I think that's why we are seeing the kind of end of what we may look back on as the first phase. I'm not entirely sure of what the transition period is going to look like. We're probably in some kind of a transition period right now. And the regrouping is, I'm sure as everybody in this room feels, deeply inspiring, particularly in the last 2 days in New York and so on. It is a bit encouraging when the mayor of Seattle apologizes, but it's a lot more discouraging that the police don't really look like they're backing off. Their problem is a PR thing. They have no intentions of not breaking up these encampments. All right. So the attitude of the elite, I think, is scarcely concealed contempt. They're not very good at concealing it, and they speak rather candidly about their anger and their annoyance at the Occupy movement. And they're guarded only for kind of opportunistic or prudential reasons. I want to look at the confluence now of circumstances that I think have given rise to Occupy. And I think that the circumstances are important to bear in mind as we struggle with the politics of Occupy. And that's why I'll talk about the specific circumstances before I talk about the politics. And I'm referring to this in my talk as the perfect storm. There are four things that have come together to kind of create the Occupy movement. And they haven't come together quickly. They've come together rather slowly. And they're there now. And I don't pretend here that the specific timing can be explained, but just the sense of expectation. We couldn't be surprised that Occupy has arisen the way it has arisen, and really when it has arisen, whether it's this year or whether it would have been 2 years ago or whether it would be 2 years from now. In that sense, it's not surprising at all. The first circumstance that has created this kind of perfect storm that has given rise to this new and terribly interesting effort, political movement, has been the assault on the working class. And this assault on the working class is 4.5 to 5 decades old, and depending on how you count it, 6 or 7. And I guess if you're really cynical, 10 or 11 decades, 13, 14, 15 decades, we can go back. And I don't think, and I certainly don't want to be in the situation where I'm romanticizing the early post-war period. In fact, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Taft-Hartley Act, because this really got underway in 1947, just after the conclusion of World War II. But in the last, it's now fashionable in the academy almost, and fashionable for political economists to talk about the neoliberal assault. And I think the important part of the message, unfortunately, is the neoliberal part, and it shouldn't be. The important part of the word neoliberal assault should be the assault part. The assault has been going on for an awfully long time. It just has this particular form, really a policy form that we can call neoliberal policy. So there is this neoliberal assault on working people. It's not even necessarily anti-democratic. It's about attacking working people. And it's always worth bearing in mind that where a lot of the movement got started, which was Seattle in 1999, Tom DeKino, who was then the head of the Business Council on National Issues, and who's nothing if not a right-wing turd, when he was being interviewed in the face of the protesters, and he called for greater parliamentary democracy and better parliamentary representation. What he didn't like was the kind of direct protest, and the expression of what you might call direct democracy. He didn't like that message. And those kinds of vignettes show that in some ways they're not really anti-democratic. What they are, fundamentally, is anti-worker. They want one very simple thing. They want your wages to go that way, and they want to make sure that their profits go this way. And the reason why we can speak of a neoliberal period is because in the late 1960s, there was a kind of crash in profitability. That corporate rates of profit, which had been fairly high between about 1945 and 1965, suddenly started to decline or crash. They went from rates of roughly 15 to 20%, and sometimes in some sectors they were even higher, 28, 29%. And suddenly they were down to 2%, and 3%, 4%. And capital, the families of capital, its lobby groups, which are very powerful, and which are always the kind of standing groups, well-funded, well-connected, and not terribly democratic, started to hatch policy plans. And they started to do this with great verve by the early 1970s. They started to fund research councils with quotes, and then another quote, and maybe even a third set of quotes around research. Research councils, they started to fund these research councils, And the research councils were charged with a very simple task. We want you to come up with policy recommendations that we want. Only we want you to hide behind the veil of legitimate academic research to do this. In the United States, for example, we see things like the Cato Institute, which has sometimes accused the International Monetary Fund of too much meddling in markets. In the Canadian context, we see the Fraser Institute and the C.D. Howe Institute, and I guess we can be proud, we have our own here in Atlantic Canada, the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies, all funded by business, and all funded by business to do one thing: reach corporate-friendly policy conclusions or policy recommendations. Anyway, they got to work by the early 1970s, but the only reason they went to work was they had had enough of the so-called post-war deal, and profitability had started to plunge, rates of profits had started to plunge, and they said, that's it, we're done with the deal. We want a new regime, we want a new policy infrastructure, we want a new policy framework. And so they went about changing policy framework, the framework. And here's what's happened in the face of the changes that they've been successfully enacting for about 40 years now. First of all, there's been a very steep decline or stagnation in wages, not only in Canada, but throughout North America. This has been happening in Europe, and I'm going to keep more of a North American focus. The decline in wages has been, according to some studies in the American context, as much as 17 or 18%, depending on what group you're looking at. Sometimes it's family wages, sometimes it's wages by sector, and so on. Sometimes it's wages by age cohort. So they change fairly significantly sometimes, but they don't change in the general direction. They're all down, and the declines have been fairly steep. Just in the last 10 years, the declines have been anywhere from 3% to 9 or 10%, depending again on what specific measures we're looking at. So wages have been falling relative to the rate of inflation, so they have been able to create this decline in real wages, and most economists would put the decline at somewhere between about 11 and 14% on the whole, as across the economy with kind of fairly leveling statistics. In the Canadian context, it's a little different. We've experienced more of stagnation. And it's kind of interesting. If you look at the 20th century, and you start about 1930 and you come up to 2010, and you're looking at the real increase in wages over a period of time, let's say we divide this like that, you get this. And one of the most interesting things is real wages in Canadian context, that is wages when you actually control for the rate of inflation, grew more in the period of the Great Depression than they've done in the last few years, because the graph really looks like this, and it's leveled off, and that's the goal. The decline hasn't been as steep as it has been in the United States. There are some sectors where we see very modest growth, there are some sectors where we see very modest declines. Some years are up on the whole, some years are down on the whole, but the overall picture is one of stagnation. So in the American context, it's one of decline, the picture usually around 11 to 14%, whereas in the Canadian context, the picture is one of stagnation. And there are different reasons for that, mainly the size of the public sector in Canada relative to the economy. That's probably the main reason. We've also seen, when all these neoliberal policies are said and done, we've also seen a steep decline in union militancy. In the U.S. sectors, in some U.S. sectors, this decline is anywhere between 60 and 90%. That's just the rate in which unions go on strike. In the Canadian context, it's about 75% on average. If we look at the last 30 to 35 years, just declines in militancy. So people are just striking less. Of course, we understand why. If we've had a brush with the working world, people are scared, they're fearful of the jobs, they're threatened, they don't feel secure, they don't feel supported. Solidarity seems to be at an all-time low, and so on. And in our province, New Brunswick, the decline is around 84%. So people are especially running scared in New Brunswick, working people. We've also seen declines in union density. This is just the number of people who are unionized relative to the overall working population. And in the American context, in the immediate aftermath of a very reactionary policy called the Taft-Hartley Act, which I'll talk about in a bit, the union density was about 28%. So almost 1 in 3 Americans was part of a union, and working Americans. And what had happened is very interesting. In the late 1930s, there was something called the Wagner Act, and people were actually going around and saying the president wants you to join a union. It had a rather dramatic effect on all aspects of American life and culture. Hollywood started making all these pro-union films. They'd make a film about a boss who was pissed off that his workers were trying to form a union, so the boss goes undercover to find out who the hell is doing it, and by the end of the movie, the boss is completely convinced that they're in the right. So Hollywood ends up making these kinds of movies. Well, by the time the war was over, American capital had enough of that. So the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 was the first real kind of pushback by capital to say we've had enough of this union nonsense, and from there on in, we've seen a slow but steady attack on the capacity of working people to organize. And it's very telling that right now, even despite all the optimism with respect to Obama, the one thing he is absolutely dragging his heels on, and the one thing he's going to drag his heels on, and the one thing he's not going to do is the employee free choices, which would actually empower workers so that they could form unions more easily, particularly if they want to move to the card system. When you have a vote, employers can do all sorts of dastardly things, and they do all sorts of dastardly things. A recent study in the American context found that there was union interference by employers in any effort to organize a union in almost 80% of the cases. And that's the study. That they're going to be conservative in their ability to garner those kinds of statistics. That's almost universal. That means that it's fairly standard and fairly normal. Union density in the American context right now has gone from about 30%, 28% or so, down to about 11%. So 11% of the 11% of American workers are now unionized, and when you control for the public sector, or when you just look at the private sector, only about 7.5% union density in the United States. So 7 out of every 100 workers is now unionized in the private sector. That's the success of Taft-Hartley. That's the success of the neoliberal policy agenda, which is basically being set by American capital, especially the economic roundtable. The fourth thing that we see is the fourth consequence that we see on working people is the deregulation of labor law, and this could take us evenings and evenings to talk about. We say deregulation because the idea was that the old regime was regulatory in the sense that it put restraints on employers. And so deregulation is a kind of loose word, a bit of a clumsy word in some respects, but it gets to the heart of the idea that there are fewer constraints now on employers when it comes to their workplace safety, when it comes to following labor law, when it comes to abiding by labor standards and so forth. A simple example of what you do, and Canadians have been very good at this, is you simply cut inspections down. You cut them down to nothing. I'll give you a very interesting example of what the Canadian government did when it was revising, when it was trying to respond to abuse of immigrant workers, and it's under its immigrant worker program, largely made up of Filipino women and Mexican laborers. They knew there was rampant complaining, so the government said, okay, well, we better respond to this. I know what we'll do. We'll post a website, and we'll put a complaint form up on the website, and it'll only be in English. That's an example of what you can do to greatly limit the kind of field reporting and the field discovery of abuses of the workforce. You've also seen, and we're all acquainted with this, the dramatic growth of the low-wage sector. Again, there's lots that we could say about this. In the Canadian context, an awfully large sector of paid jobs, awfully large number of paid jobs hover remarkably close to the minimum wage. Often only $2 or $3 or $4 difference between the legislated minimum wage and what upwards of 25% of your working people are earning. And this is true for almost every province. One of the most interesting stats over the years that I discovered was back in the mid-2000s, about 2003, I guess, in Newfoundland, 25% of all hourly female employees, female workers receiving an hourly wage, I guess that's the proper way to say it, 25% were within 57 cents of the minimum wage. So it gives you a sense of what the low-wage sector looks like. And lastly, again, we're familiar with this, most of us by direct experience, the gutting of the social welfare system and the gutting of the UI system. And I know I'm not supposed to say UI because it's EI now. Among some of the real crappy things that the Chrétien government did in the early 90s was when they gutted the EI program, and they had about 3 legislative packages that went through and just gutted it. That's why you have a big surplus now in the EI. That's why they're apparently going to give students some money now, because they have to figure out how to get the safety valve off. They know that it's politically not very good to spend too much of the surplus, so now they make it a little easier for 3rd and 4th year students to get a little bit of money from that system. And students are a bit excited about that. And if you can get a little bit of money from this government, go for it. If you can get a little money from the EI program, God bless you, because it's not easy to do now. So what Chrétien did is he said, well, it's not an unemployment program anyway. So he renamed it. He said it's employment insurance, emphasizing, of course, the employability of every able-bodied person in the country. Okay, so that's the first part of the perfect storm. These policies and the dramatic effect. What they mean is people are just working for less money. Everybody knows that wages are falling and that the purchasing power of wages, even if it's not registering as an actual decline in real value, the purchasing power of wages is going down when we look at many of the items that we absolutely need. The second thing that has happened is the growth of the financial sector globally. I'll just give you 4 stats to put this in perspective, and they're really statistics on the same thing. And this is the ratio between banking assets, which is the size of banks and their holdings, banking assets, and the world's GDP. Okay? So in 1950, that ratio was 1 to 1. In 1990, the ratio was 2 to 1. In 2000, the ratio was 3 to 1. And by 2010, the ratio was 4 to 1. So that's an awful lot of assets, money, sitting in the world's banks. Now, what do you do with that money? Well, you have to lend it out. You have to. It's not the worst thing you can have in the capitalist system is money sitting in a bank account. You don't want to do that. The money has to be circulated. It has to get out there. And you try to get a return on that money when you lend it. Why is this the case? Well, it's not profitable in capitalism to invest in factories forever. Factories aren't that profitable. So as you make money, you can only build so many factories. Why that is, economists don't agree at all, really, as to why that is. And the only kind of one of the kind of predominant readings of this problem comes from Marx. Marx's labor theory of value and the tendency of the rate of profit fall, and his emphasis on the fact that the very internal structure of capital, as it's kind of established, it means that you don't or you can't always build factories. It's not profitable. So you pull some of this money out of the productive realm, out of the production of goods and services, and you put it into the financial sector. And what we've seen between 1950 and 2010 is the ballooning of the financial sector. That's a lot of money waiting to be put into bonds, waiting to be put into mortgages, waiting to be put into loans. It's an awful lot of money. Third part of the perfect storm. This is the growth of state and personal debt. Let's look first at the growth of state debt. We live in an era of declining revenues for states, and the main reason for declining revenues for states is because you can't attack corporations that are on the move. And they can be on the move if you offend them. Capital has a lot of mobility in this day and age, and so therefore there doesn't seem to be, at this moment at least, the necessary political will to tax corporations. Corporate taxes as a percentage of revenues for all Western states has fallen precipitously. In the Canadian context, it's gone down from about 23% to something around 3 or 4. We're not sure. It might be lower. A study done about 20 years ago discovered that the Canadian debt could be accounted for, half of the Canadian debt could be accounted for just by not bothering to collect the taxes that was owed to the states by corporations. To say nothing about the actual laws that had been enacted to ensure that corporations weren't on the hook for many taxes. So you've seen two changes go on everywhere. One, you've revised laws to make corporations pay less tax, and also you've seen a kind of declining tendency to actually collect on the money. The what we call corporate tax deferrals have skyrocketed. There's a structural reason for this, and that's that they fear, politicians come to fear, that the corporations will leave, basically. In an era of heightened capital mobility, that the corporations will simply leave. So they've lost a real willingness to tax. And secondly, what this does is it puts them into a terrible financial predicament. So, spending on social programs has been largely stable in Western liberal democracies. It's stable in the Canadian context. It's stable in the American context once you control from the military. It's stable in the Western European context. In the European context, it's absolutely stable. It hasn't been rising relative to gross domestic product that much. Very small, 1 or 2%. So why have the debts been rising? Why is it now the case that you have to throw out more and more bonds, and you have to collect bonds as part of revenue, and you have to keep raising the yields on these bonds in order to fund your programs, when the cost of these programs are not increasing relative to the size of your economy? It's because states are now in a structural problem with respect to revenues and their capacity to raise revenues. They cannot raise revenues now because capital will say, oh, we're out of here. We're off. We'll go somewhere else. And capital flight's a very common problem that all states have been contending with. So there's the structural problem. So every time Neil MacDonald gets on CBC and says Greece has to rein in its spending, it's an asinine comment, because Greece hasn't been out of control. It really hasn't changed significantly, and that's the key. It looks like somehow there's runaway government spending, largesse here, bloviating politicians trying to buy votes there, and that's not what's happening at all. They're in a structural crisis where they have to continually raise bond yields because they can't tax the corporations. At the same time, there's been a growth of personal debt. Why? Because of falling incomes. The family debt at one point was about 20% of income, overall income. And now the ratio is about 1 to 1. And in some cases, it's about 1.2 to 1. So if you make $100,000 a year, it's not uncommon now to have $120,000 in debt. That will include mortgages. So the reason why you see this is because you have embedded consumption. You have to continually buy products and goods and services and so forth. You can't go out and make them in this day and age, but wages have been falling. And there's all this money, and they want to lend it, and people need to borrow it. So you've had a dramatic increase in household and consumer debt. And this is another part of this perfect storm that is leading to, coming together to lead to Occupy. It's one of the most common stories that you hear from people who are actually out and actively involved in the movement, particularly in the United States. And the last part of this, which may be a bit more controversial, I think, is the disintegration of the left. The last factor in this, in the four things that come together to create this perfect storm. The left is not in a good way right now. And it's kind of paradoxical because we're more active than we've probably ever been, but we have less, it seems that we have less and less to show for it. We seem very fragmented, and there have been several observers who have made that observation. We don't seem to really point a finger at capitalism, but rather we point a finger at bad public policy. There really is a decline, even though this is a class assault, and even though it's a class assault that has been underway since 1947 and was reinvigorated in the early 1970s, we don't talk about it that way. And it's very strange. There's a complete lack of class discourse in the North American political context. A little more in Europe, but it's not significantly greater. We see the neoliberalization of left parties. Most left parties in Europe and North America have basically bought into the neoliberal agenda, hook, line, and sinker, and the NDP is as equally guilty of this as the Democrats in the United States. And we see, I think, what we might call nationalist excesses, the idea that somehow this is happening to Canadians. No, it's happening everywhere. We are not unique. We are not special. We have not been selected out for some special brand of assault. what is happening in the Canadian context is a global phenomenon, and it certainly is a widely shared North American phenomenon. All right, well that leads us to the idea that there's 4 elements here, and the 4th element is the difficulties that we have been experiencing on the left. Those factors that come together to create this perfect storm brings us to the political character of Occupy. And this is a little more difficult because our sympathies, everybody's sympathies in this room are strongly with the spirit of the protesters and strongly with the spirit of the movement. There appears to be what I would say is a contradiction at the heart of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And the contradiction is basically a commonplace one. I've seen it before. It's between a kind of critique of capitalism, or somehow the claim that the problem is capitalism. It's capitalism that is broke. It is capitalism that is causing the problems. You've got to sweep away some or all of capitalism in order to get past this kind of a problem. And that's one part of the critique. And if you just look at the placards, a lot of the placards are suggestive in this sense and so forth. And the other part, and I'm concerned a bit that it's becoming the bigger part and it becoming even larger, and I think it is the dominant part, has been the dominant theme from the outset, is that it's just bad policies. This is bad regulation, especially bad regulation of the financial sector, and that it is the problem really is more about governments not having the political will to tax the rich. The governments don't have the political will to confront capital businesses directly and make them pay their fair share. The government doesn't have the political will to respond directly to the grievous injustices that are rampant in the capitalist economies. So that it's not so much capitalism that needs to be swept away as the policies inside. Capitalist social relations are okay. Everybody just wants a job. Everybody wants to put in an honest day's work, and everybody wants to make sure that we are treated fairly. And so the movement itself has this tension right at the heart of it. And even the placards. I've watched some of the demonstrations, and it's almost interesting. You have one placard with the one kind of message on it about fixing the policies, and another placard with the other kind of message, which is about sweeping away capitalism. I know from the publications that these issues have been explored. It's interesting, one person observed that their libraries that were set up that apparently really pissed off the police. It was one of the first things they took away. The libraries that had books that reflected the problem as capitalism, and then there were reading materials and books that said, you know, we got to change, fix the policies. Capitalism may not be great, but we can make it work a hell of a lot better than it has been working now. So there's this tension, or contradiction, or inconsistency right at the heart of the movement. It's not about to be resolved anytime soon. But I do think the dominant message is what you would call liberal populism. Liberal populism has been around since the 1880s. It was around in the North American context when we encountered the Knights of Labor. It has a very straightforward message. It says, let's make capitalism fairer. Let's make the system just more generous for people. Let's make it so that people aren't kind of screwed over. Let's make it so that when people put in an honest day's work, they receive an honest day's pay, and let's make it so that they can count on keeping a job, especially when they commit to a job for their lifetime or for their career at least. We say populist only because it doesn't really have an obvious class language to it. While it is very easy to show that this has been a class assault on working people and working wages, the language is a little fuzzy, and it says it's so that with the 99%, the 1% versus the 99%. Well, it's not even. If you really look at it, they're clumsy ideas. They work well as slogans. They've caught on like wildfire. Politically, who can deny the traction that they? But they're not. It's not a language that suggests that the best way to understand the problem that has confronted working people in North America is to speak a language of class assault, class struggle by, I would stress, a capitalist class,
and we can identify them. As Michael Moore has said many times, you can identify them by family, by name, by their multiple residencies, and by the companies they control. They are there, their agenda is clear, and it's not really hard to put faces and families to names, and faces, families, and names to the idea of a class. The emphasis also, why I would suggest that it looks like the main kind of political message that has been emerging as a liberal populist message, is that it's emphasizing overarching ties. It's emphasizing the idea of Canadian democracy or American democracy. The ideas of Americana have been very powerful in the Occupy movement. Not perfectly so, but it just seems to be some of the dominant themes that have been emerging. Certainly this is the way in which the elite, the journalistic elite, has been framing the actual struggle. And in the end, the dominant message seems to be a return to liberal reform. It's about making the tax system fair. It's about